Let me invite you to open up your Bibles to John chapter 21. We read from just a moment ago. It is good to see each one, and especially to our visitors. We're thankful to have you with us. I'm going to get into the lesson pretty quickly this morning because there's a lot of material that I would like to cover. As we look at some of the reactions, Tony was talking about the uncertainty. It is certainly a strange year. And lots of commentary on the strangeness of this year. There's lots of things that people have said that I think betray some lazy thinking, some loose thinking, certainly some thinking that doesn't seem to be based on God's Word. And as far as the world's concerned, that's always and ever will be. But I'm concerned at things that I see brethren say along the way, in trying to cope with times that we do not draw on familiarity. We're drawing on experiences that we don't have. And so it's uncharted territory, and so we're dealing with it unique times and maybe in unique fashions, and maybe it's causing us to dig a little deeper, and maybe some of us don't have the depth to dig from. That's a problem. And so I've just been trying to think and sort of catalog some of the things that are concerning to me about the way people are thinking, and try to deal with some of those in some lessons over the next couple or 3 months. This morning, I want to deal with the idea that I think is represented there in John chapter 21 with Peter's question about what's going to happen to John. So Jesus gives Peter some bad news, and Peter points over and says, what about that guy? And ultimately, Jesus' response is, what is that to you? And all of this is after really a confrontational moment between Jesus and Peter, where he asks him 3 times, do you love me? I think that's reflective of the 3 times that Peter has only recently denied Jesus. And Peter gets the sting, if you will. And so Jesus encourages Peter that he is going to have a role in the kingdom, but that his role is going to involve some pain, some suffering, and his end is alluded to here in ways that seems to point to a similar death to that of Jesus. Peter wants to know, is it going to be fair? Is John going to suffer too, or is it just going to be me? And essentially the message is, it's none of your business. I just told you what you need to worry about. And it's not what's going to happen to John. I think that's a very important thought as we go into some of the consequences of that, some of the lessons that we can learn, and some of the lessons we can learn in the midst of, I think, our current turmoil. I want to start with this concept. Life is not fair. It is not fair, it has not been fair, and it never will be fair. And I know that that's a trite thing, and I know that it's a flippant thing that is said all of the time. It's a true thing. And if people are not saying it and teaching it to their children, they are setting themselves up for disaster and misery. Now you think, well, it's a miserable thing to say. It is, sort of. But it's a truthful thing to say, and it's a thing that if you get a hold of it, you can live really a happier life knowing that life's not fair. The real misery is thinking that one day it will be, and always hoping that just around the corner, just around the bend, are the rainbows and the silver lining, and one day, if we get everything worked out and people all behave themselves, why then life will be fair. Peter's worried about this in our text in John chapter 21. That's what he's doing. He's pointing over to John and saying, is everybody going to get equal treatment? I want to make sure it all works out the same. And Jesus not only tells him, doesn't give him that assurance, he says, you don't even have a right to know what's going to happen to John. It's not yours. I know that we have in our minds a sense of fairness, a sense of equality and egalitarianism that goes back to the very founding of our nation. As inconsistent as we may find some of the aspects of the founding, at least the principle is there. We want all men to be equal. And there's a sense in which it's a noble goal, but there's a sense in which in reality it never will be true. And I even think sometimes we inculcate in our children the notion that they have a right, a deserving of fairness. And it comes, I think, from good intentions. And I, being the recipient of that sometimes, have appreciated it. My grandmother, all growing up, I remember as she was buying us Christmas gifts, my grandmother, one of my grandmothers is here this morning, she would buy us Christmas gifts, and she would work it out so that however much she spent on one child she spent on, we would occasionally get a check for like $23.72 to make sure that all of us got just the same amount. Well, I understand and I appreciate it would not have been inappropriate for her to not write those checks. It'd be okay. And if I had looked over and said about my sister, what about her? What is that to you? You don't even deserve the gifts you do have. Now, she would never say that, but she ought to have. Because I didn't. They were all grace and mercy. And what an absurd thing that I would say at the gift that I received. I would look over at other people's and wonder why everybody else has bigger presents. I want it all to be equal. Jesus says it's not. It's none of your business. And it's not your problem to try to work all of that out. Not only does God not promise us that we will have equality, especially in this life, but he says that we should heartily submit to the inequality. Nothing is more grievous to us than the notion of slaves and masters. To the point that in our society, we speak of slavery not just in terms of its abuses, but in terms of its very existence. That it should never be that one person is master and owner over another person. God says all who are under the yoke as slaves are to regard their own masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and our doctrine will not be spoken against. Those who have believers as their masters must not be disrespectful to them because they are brethren, but must serve them all the more, because those who partake of the benefit are believers and beloved. Teach and preach these principles, he says to Timothy. I'm going to tell you what, for most people, that was no more popular a sentiment when Paul wrote it than it is now. That the concept, the very notion of the haves and the have-nots, that's always been. That's not like modern politics. That's very ancient politics. And Paul says, you Christians, you're not a part of that. And in fact, when you are a have-not who is working for a have, if he's a Christian, you especially are not worried about the inequality. In fact, you're glad to be providing for somebody that's a brother in Christ. You talk about radical in the very opposite direction of what we often think of as radical. So he doesn't say, let's work out all the details. God doesn't preach democracy, not anywhere in his scriptures. I love it. I'm glad we live under democracy. It's a wonderful thing for earthly contentment and earthly comforts. But it is not the biblical way. God doesn't lay out the biblical way for government. He lays out the biblical way for Christians to respond to whatever government they live under. Even the ones that we really, really hate. He also, I think, points out that if you do focus on the inequalities, and if that becomes the thing that you are consumed by, then it often leads to ignoring all of the blessings that we have received. It leads to ingratitude, and ultimately, I believe that it leads to bitterness towards God, which we'll get to in just a moment. Going back over to Matthew chapter 20. Matthew chapter 20, there's the parable of the workman that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, where the landowner goes out and he hires several workmen beginning at the first hour of the day there. And he goes throughout the day at succeeding hours and hires more and more workmen until at the end he begins to pay them. and he pays them from the last one who showed up to the first one. And as the last ones receive what the first ones were promised, the first ones assume that they will receive, more because they showed up first, even though they agreed to the same sum. It says, when they received, the same as everybody else, the same as they agreed to, verse 11, they grumbled at the landowner, saying, these last men have worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden and the scorching heat of the day. But he answered them and said to one of them, friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what is yours and go. But I wish to give you this last, I wish to give this last man the same as you. Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with what is my own? Or is your eye envious because I am generous? So the last shall be first and the first last. It is envious. It's envious at his generosity. He wants the generosity to be aimed here. And when it's aimed elsewhere, and in a measure that I think is too much, and I'm not getting as much, we are all beggars who show up and are angry when we are not dispensed as much grace as everybody else. But every one of these workers received a gift. Everyone received at least as much as he agreed to, if not more. And there should be no grievance. There should be gratitude in each case. Chapter 6 and verse 3, back over to 1 Timothy. After he gives these principles regarding the servants and the masters, he says, if anyone advocates a different doctrine and does not agree with sound words, those of our Lord Jesus Christ, and with the doctrine conforming to godliness, he is conceited and understands nothing. He has a morbid interest in controversial questions and disputes about words, out of which arise envy, strife, abusive language, evil suspicions, and constant friction between men of depraved mind and deprived of the truth, who suppose that godliness is a means of gain. There are people who go around preaching that the way to eradicate the inequalities is the gospel. It's health and wealth. This is what's going to lift everybody up in physical terms. And he says, they are wicked men. And you have nothing to do with them. You pick up a book and it gives you the notion that the gospel is going to work out all the physical inequalities. You set that book down and you walk away. Because that does nothing but drive wedges further between men, while it is the gospel that will bring them together. He says, but godliness actually is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. For we have brought nothing into the world, so we cannot take anything out of it either. No matter what you have, it is more than you deserve. If we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. That is not the gospel that the world is preaching. The world is preaching that so long as there are inequalities, that revolution is in order. And the scriptures say, not when Christians are involved, not where we have a say. Contentment is our message, not envy. In the case of Job, Job is suffering, and his inequality is not deserved. And it is interesting as we look through the book of Job, and so much is taken away from him in spite of his righteousness, in spite of all that he has done to, we might say, earn his blessings. And as his friends, using that in heavy quotations, come and point out and lean on the inequality and blame Job himself and his own wickedness for the inequality, he focuses on it and he takes his eyes off of God. And when he points his eyes back towards God, he begins to say things like this: the tents of the destroyers prosper, and those who provoke God are secure, whom God brings into their power. God is so friendly to the wicked. That is the message of the world. That is the message of social reform. Especially as it continues down that path, eventually most of them start pointing their fingers at God and wondering why He hasn't worked it all out. And in fact, one of the reasons is when they come to Scriptures, if they're soaking it all in, they find that He doesn't even care to work it all out. Not here. And in fact, oftentimes He's willing to dump some of it out to help us, to give us some of the suffering, like He does with Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. So when your children come and say life's not fair, don't disabuse them of that. Help them to accept that so that they can learn how to adapt and live in a world that is indeed not fair, as opposed to constantly going around being more and more embittered the more they realize this truth. It's okay. The notion, when we teach children that we will work it all out, my parents never gave me any indication that if I came to them and showed them something, here is some unfairness. I tell you what, I just don't ever remember them saying, well, let me get my keys and we're going to go set right what's wrong. No, it was more like, yeah, I'm glad you're learning that. You'll learn it more. I have a teacher who's been mean to me. You'll have bosses that are mean to you. What are you going to do? You're going to come to me then? Some people do. I know people who run businesses who say that their adult employees are still getting their mothers to come and plead their case. And it's because somewhere along the way they got the notion that life should be fair and your bosses should always be nice and everything should work out. And God says it's not. It's never going to be. You're going to suffer. And if you suffer well, and if you deal with life's inequalities well, we will one day be at a place where all of those are wiped away because the causes of them will be gone. That is, all the ungodliness, which we will come to later. Another aspect that goes along with that is the idea of accountability and what God expects of us. In a world that is unfair, what is expected of the people who are dealing with the unfairness? Well, in the first place, I want to say we are responsible even when what is required of us seems impossible. It feels nearly impossible. Even the biblical writers themselves indicate that near impossibility, and I want to stress that near impossible. It's very difficult. He says in James chapter 3 and in verse 2, we all stumble in many ways, but if anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. He goes on to talk about how we direct horses and we direct ships, but the tongue, so also the tongue, he says, is a small part of the body and yet boasts of great things. See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, the very world of iniquity. The tongue is set among our members as that which defiles the entire body and sets on fire the course of our life, and it is set on fire by hell. For every species of beasts and birds, of reptiles and creatures of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by the human race, but no one can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil and full of deadly poison. Do you think what what James means there is that the tongue is so difficult, don't even worry about it? You know, it's just not worth the effort. It's impossible. You can't do it. Let it go. Let it rip. Just say whatever you're thinking and don't worry about control because we can't do it anyway. No, he's saying, I'm telling you, this is how hard it is, which means you better get to work. Right? He doesn't say it's so hard to relieve us of responsibility, but to help us understand the responsibility. It's way up here. Don't take it lightly. Don't take it easy, because it will run away with you and it will destroy you. So do the impossible. Do what is difficult. Bridle the tongue. And of course, all of this is written in the context of leaning on God. You yourself will never accomplish this. And we understand that. And yet the responsibility we are called upon is to take up that strength that is given to us and do something about it, and not just shrug our shoulders and say, well, who can do it? You. Me. That's why he's writing those things. Matthew chapter 12 and in verse 36, we compare this to what James says. I tell you that every careless word that people speak, they shall give an accounting for it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. Who can tame the tongue? It better be me. Because here, Jesus says as plain as possible, I remember every word that comes out of your mouth. What a sobering notion. And so, don't let yourself off the hook, because it's really hard. One of the things that I hear most frequently when I'm studying with people, and I'm trying to lay out responsibilities, here's what you need to do, and they'll say, well, that's easier said than done. And I'm like, that's the whole Bible. It's all easier said than done. And yet it all must be done. None of it is God saying, here, I'm going to give you something. You can't really do it, but it'd be nice if you could. It is all meant for us to take hold of and do something with it. And so we are accountable, even when it's hard. We're accountable, even when we are being sorely mistreated. Over in 1 Peter chapter 2, which we have had occasion to look at recently as we have thought about the death of Christ. 1 Peter chapter 2, and beginning in verse 18, he says, their servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. For this finds favor, if for the sake of conscience towards God, a person bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly. For what credit is there if when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if, when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. I think about that, and I think about the excuses that we all bring to the table. And we say, people will actually say, look, one fella said to me, I can't be held accountable for what I do the next time that she says this, talking about his wife. And I'm like, well, you can, and you actually will. He said, but she. No, I got it. And we'll talk about she in just a minute. You will be held accountable for what you are doing no matter what. Unreasonable master treats you badly, you're going to be held accountable. In fact, when he goes through and he says, if you suffer patience, we think it's rather noble if somebody takes their just punishment. He says, that's not even that noble. We don't even do that well. He says, but if you just did that, that would be like a baseline. But to go on and actually have the injustice and just take it, that is not what the world is preaching. Don't take it, scream it to the rafters and tell everybody about it. And you get to do whatever you want if you've been treated unjustly. In some cases, it's a literal get out of jail free card. There are no more standards anymore if you have been treated unjustly. God says that is the very reason Jesus came, or at least part of the reason he came is so that you can look and you can see this is what ought to be. This is what righteousness does in the face of mistreatment. It is our responsibility to behave in the face of that. It is our responsibility to behave even when somebody else is pulling us away. In Genesis chapter 3, we often turn there and we look at the sequence of events where the serpent comes to the woman shares the food with her husband, and then as God comes into the garden and speaks to Adam, he says, "Who told you that you were naked?" Verse 11, "Have you eaten from the tree which I commanded you not to eat?" The man said, "The woman that you gave to be with me, she gave me from the tree and I ate." The Lord said to the woman, "What is it that you have done?" The woman said that the serpent deceived me and I ate. And then what does God do? He comes in and he starts there. It's not that there's no responsibility of the one doing the pulling. He starts with the serpent and then he works his way back. He says to the serpent, "You are cursed in this way." And then he says to the woman, "You are cursed in this way." And then he says to the man. And so as they pass blame on down, he says, "All right, I'll start here. Start here at the source. But then we'll go to the one he influenced, and then we'll go to the one she influenced." And you don't get to say, "Well, they said it would be okay." Okay, well then they'll be in trouble too. But you knew better. You knew what the rules were. As we look over to Matthew chapter 18. In Matthew chapter 18, where Jesus is talking about the children and then moves over into a discussion of spiritual children. "Whoever causes one of these," he says, "one of these little ones who believes in me to stumble, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks, for it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come. Woe to the man through whom the stumbling block comes." He'll be judged. And he'll be judged harshly even. There'll be significant judgment for the one who leads others astray. Or as Jesus says to the Pharisees, leading others and making them twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. There's harsh judgment for them. But what about the people who got led astray? They're still astray. And it's our responsibility, even when others are doing the leading, not to be followers of wickedness. If it's your parents, if it's your friends, if it's your teachers, it doesn't matter. At some point, you've got to make your own decisions. You've got to take responsibility for your own welfare. You will stand before the judgment seat of Christ, and it will not be side by side with your parents where they'll take away guilt from you and you won't be guilty anymore. You'll be responsible. What about just culture in general? We live in a wicked culture. You can't expect people who grow up in that kind of lifestyle to do right. Yes, you can. When Paul wrote to Titus, who is preaching in a very wicked society, so wicked that Paul is willing to say of the society in general. He was willing to use one of their own poets' terminologies. He says, one of themselves, a prophet of their own, said, "Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. This testimony," he says, "is true. For this reason, reprove them severely so that they may be sound in the faith." What's the solution? Tell them the truth. Tell them that this lifestyle will lead you to hell. I don't care if your mama did it and your grandparents. I don't care how many generations you've been steeped in this sin. The gospel is the only thing that'll get them out. But it will get them out. And Paul says you need to be preaching to Cretans. Yeah, but you just can't preach to them. Look at the way they live. I know, that's why they need the gospel. Preach it. Tell them they can't live like this anymore. And apparently he was able to make enough of a foothold that not only was a church able to be established there, but Paul expects Titus to go appoint elders in that church. You can. You can be righteous in a wicked culture, in a culture saturated with it, to the point that it is commonly regarded and discussed in these kinds of terms. Paul says it's not a false stereotype, it's real. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. This is what God still expects of these people. You're accountable even when you don't mean any harm. As I read through the Old Testament, I am struck by the level of accountability that God calls his people to. And one place in particular strikes me, and that is when it comes to the laws of the cities of refuge. In Numbers chapter 35, in particular, these laws are laid out. If you're not familiar, the laws of the city of refuge laid out there are first of all, that the cities would be sort of evenly distributed throughout the land. 3 on the east side of the Jordan and 3 on the west side of the Jordan, north, middle, and south, so that they can be easily accessible. And what happens there is that if you kill someone by accident, and it lays out accident, and it's basically manslaughter. You kill them, but you don't mean to. Even if you get into sort of a scuffle and you shove your neighbor, but you don't mean anything by it, like you're not laying in wait. That's the language that's used. It's not like you plotted to kill him. Maybe somewhere you got into a fuss and you shoved him and he died. So even to that point, another illustration that's used is more accidental. So there's no malice whatsoever. You're just chopping wood, and the head of your axe flies off its handle and whacks him in the head, and he dies. What do you do now? He says, you take off running, and you get to one of these cities of refuge. And there's going to be a council convened, and they're going to decide what happened. And if it happens that indeed it was an accident, then you get refuge. But guess what? You got to stay there, and you can't leave. And he says, if you do leave, if you walk out of that city, the avenger of blood, they have a right to your blood. Because God considers the taking of life so grievous that even doing so by accident, he says, there will be consequences. You say, but the guy's innocent. He is, in so much as he certainly didn't mean to do that. And yet, part of the language is, by your hand, you're the one swinging the axe. And so there's a responsibility, and you will stay there until that priest, the high priest who's in charge then, dies. So his whole life is ruined? Yes. See, we don't want to deal with things like that. We don't want to deal with consequences where we didn't mean any harm. And we are constantly telling people when they have been involved in an accident, and it is an accident, that there's no consequences. You get into an automobile accident, may not be your fault. Or maybe it's your fault only from the standpoint of legally it's your fault, but there's all sorts of reasons you were in that wreck that certainly there's a moral culpability on your part, weather conditions and so forth. Somebody's got to pay for it. And you say, well, it's not fair. Go back to point number 1. This is the world we live in. And there are consequences to our behavior even when we have no intention to cause harm. And somebody needs to be there to pay for the damages. And God says, here's a way where you're going to show how aggrieved you are that by your hand somebody's life is gone. Somewhere along the same lines, but a little bit differently, a little bit further, we might say you're accountable even when you don't know any better. At least at some level. I understand there's a don't know any better that involves mental capacity. I'm not talking about that. But in Leviticus chapter 4, it begins to lay out the protocol for when sins have been committed. It says, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, if a person sins unintentionally in any of the things which the Lord has commanded not to be done and commits any of them. There's a number of ways that could happen. Unintentionally could mean you didn't know, and later on it talks about that. You don't know, and it kind of comes to your awareness. Here's what you do. Unintentionally could mean that you know the law, but but there are ways that maybe you committed this sin and you understand what the law says, but you didn't understand what you were doing was a violation of that. There could be a number of ways that could happen. The bottom line is, he says, sacrifice must be made. Again, we think that ignorance removes all moral culpability. It does not. And especially as God has revealed the law and showed it to his people, and then, you don't get to just plead ignorance. Now, I know there may be some circumstance where you say, yes, but this person didn't know. Well, maybe the moral culpability is not as high. Certainly, these sacrifices are a lot different than stone the person. You see, God gives varying levels of punishment, varying levels of consequences based on the knowledge, the understanding. Is it a high-handed sin? That's going to be treated very differently. Is it a sin of unintentional nature? That's going to be different. And so maybe we sin against each other and somebody says, well, I didn't mean to. I didn't know. Okay. Well, the sin's still been committed and the consequences still are what they are. And they don't remove accountability and responsibility. Maybe one of the most important things for us to learn in our modern context is that we are morally accountable even when under tremendous strain. In Jeremiah chapter 12, and in verse 5, Jeremiah comes to God and he lays out the circumstances of Israel. He is distraught, frustrated, angry. God's response in verse 5 is, if you have run with footmen and they have tired you out, then how can you compete with horses? If you fall down in a land of peace, how will you do in the thicket of the Jordan? I have heard so many excuses made for bad behavior because it's just a rough year. Number one, if it was the roughest of years, we'd still have more responsibility. Number two, the horses hadn't even got here yet. Are you kidding me? You think this is bad? How are you going to? That's what God says. If you struggle in this, and let me just say, what he's saying is the footmen, and what he's saying is the land of peace is really bad and way worse than anything we're dealing with. And he calls that the footmen. Let me tell you, we are still in a land of peace. And if we go around saying we can't deal with this, God is going, woof, I got bad news for you. It hasn't got bad yet. But we think that's too mean. We shouldn't say that to people. God thought that was the appropriate thing to say to a man who suffered more than anybody in this room probably will for your whole life. And God thought it appropriate to say, Jeremiah, you better toughen up. And I think we have lost toughness as a virtue. And we have made softness in and of itself. I understand the need for compassion. I understand there's a sense in which kindness and gentleness, there's a softness that we ought to have. But we have made softness in and of itself a virtue and toughness a vice. We are accountable even when the whole world is crashing down around us. He says, Jeremiah, get up. I got work for you to do. It's time to run. When the whole world is got to go to bed for the day. Not us. There's work to do. We're tougher than that. I think that there absolutely needs to be balance to all this. One of the reasons I'm leaning so much is because I think the world has leaned entirely the other direction. And when I say the world, I mean the religious world right along with them is leaning the whole other direction and preaching softness and preaching permission, permissiveness. There is a balance to be had. That balance starts here. that accountability is not a zero-sum game. What do I mean by that? The notion that this person is accountable does not make this other person somehow that percentage less accountable. We need to understand that when people come and they have marriage problems, generally what happens is the husband or the wife walks in and wants to know, what percentage of the problems in our marriage am I responsible for? I believe it's around 20, maybe even down to 15%, but certainly no more than 20%. Let me just say, you're 100% responsible for the problems you cause. They're all yours. Whatever those are. You say, well, now I'm not 100% responsible because I only do that when he does this. Your response to whatever he does is 100% yours. Now, it may not be. What you do may not be as bad as what he's doing. That may be true. But what you're doing, 100% yours. Over in Deuteronomy chapter 22. Deuteronomy chapter 22. And in verse 23. It says there, if there's a girl who is a virgin engaged to a man, and another man finds her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death. The girl because she did not cry out in the city, and the man because he has violated his neighbor's wife. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. But if in the field the man finds the girl who is engaged, and the man forces her and lies with her, then only the man who lies with her shall die, but you shall do nothing to the girl. There is no sin in the girl worthy of death. For just as a man rises against his neighbor and murders him, so is this case. When he has found her in the field, the engaged girl cried out, but there was no one to save her. I'll tell you what the world would call that. They'd call that victim blaming. It's not, you expect her to do something? You expect that she's got responsibility? You're just taking away. You're saying what he did. No, notice, he dies no matter what. Do you see that? This man is guilty no matter what. And he's going to die at the end of this. The only question is she also guilty? I think we've lost that sense in our society. That when wrongs are committed, there's always got to be a guilty, there's always got to be an innocent. Sometimes we've just got two guilty parties. I remember listening to a football player in an alleged rape case a few years ago, and there was evidence that they had indeed slept together. And he got up at a press conference and he says, I have done nothing wrong. And I was like, whoa. You did something wrong. We're just trying to figure out what. See, there's no question that he had committed sexual immorality. The question was she a willing participant or not? That's really the only question. And that's really what God is saying here. You are guilty. This man, he's certainly guilty. Because it doesn't contemplate the notion that the woman forced herself because of the physical aspects of it. The question is, was she forced? And what's the evidence? Well, it's a matter of what the only part she's responsible for. She's not responsible for fighting him off, for overpowering him, but she's responsible to do what she can. Cry out. Did you resist? It's all we want to know. But it's the difference between guilt and innocence. And see, today we've gotten so far, we can't even ask the question. When somebody comes and says, this is the way I've grown up. This is the way but my parents treated me. That's terrible. That's terrible. Here's what you're going to have to do to get yourself to a place of happiness and joy. Here's how you get back on track. Are you saying I've got to do something? Yeah, you've got to do something. But they're the ones who are guilty. That's right. That's right. But they can't fix it. It's like somebody got stabbed and they come to the doctor and the doctor says, here's what you're going to have to do to treat the wound. I've got to treat the wound? What are you going to say about them? Well, they're not here for treatment. Well, something ought to be done about them. Something ought to be done about them. But I'm a doctor. And all I can do is help you treat the wound. And when people come and they say, this is how I've been treated, therefore I'm headed down this path. Right. And there is blame on your parents or whoever it is that helped you get down there. They'll suffer. They'll have the millstone hung around their neck and be cast into the sea. But do you want to go down with them? And you've got some responsibility. Over in Matthew chapter 10 and in verse 16, Matthew chapter 10 and in verse 16, Jesus uses this phrase. He says, behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. You've got some responsibility to use your head. I hear people say, when somebody says, don't go to this part of the city at this time of day, or maybe sometimes at any time of day, you say, well, if people were behaving like they ought to, oh, goodness. They never have. And they won't. And so if you go down to that part of town and you get mugged, you get held up or murdered, then the murderer will have the responsibility for the murder. And we won't take anything away from that. But you'll have the responsibility of being a fool who wouldn't listen to advice. And I think that somehow we're not able to hold those two things in our hands at the same time. We need to understand that our sphere of responsibility and influence is very limited. Matthew chapter 7 and verse 1 through verse 5 speaks of starting with that sphere right here. Don't go past your nose. Just start right here. Make sure this is the first thing that receives the judgment. This is the first thing that receives the adjustment. What needs to be done? I'm accountable right here. Over in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul talks about an extended responsibility. And he says that goes out to the church that you are a part of. That is, you have become a part of a group of people, a congregation of people who have come together and agreed on terms of fellowship. Here are the terms of fellowship. And if someone begins to violate and refuses to do anything about the violation of those terms of fellowship, then we terminate the fellowship. And somebody wants to know some details. He says in verse 9, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with immoral people. I did not at all mean with the immoral people of this world, or with the covetous and the swindlers or the idolaters, for then you would have to go out of the world. But actually I wrote to you not to associate with any so-called brother, if he is an immoral person or covetous or an idolater or a reviler or a drunkard or a swindler, not to even eat with such a woman or such a one. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? You not judge those who are within the church, but those who are outside, God judges. Remove the wicked man from among yourselves. If somebody comes to me and they talk about mistreatment, and it's a general mistreatment out of the world, okay. What on earth do you think that we can do about that? If it's inside the church, tell me who, tell me what, let's deal with it. I think that people suppose we have more power than we do. This is one of my frustrations when I was on the HOA board. People would come in and say, there's people driving down the road with the music too loud. Okay. My neighbor is, I can't remember what the things were that they would say that their neighbors were doing that didn't violate the covenants. And I would say, it sounds like your neighbor's not a very nice person. They said, yeah, what are you going to do about it? I said, we're not the jerk police. Nothing. I'm going to tell you to try to be a good neighbor. And if somebody comes to me and says, here's how I've been wrong, the only thing I know to do is give them this, which says, here's what you should do. It's what my parents have done all my life. And what I have tried to pass on to my children. If they come to me with complaints about how other people are behaving, my first question will always be, how have you behaved? Always. And when I would say to my parents, better than him, yeah, well, he's not my kid. You are. So you're the one that I'm responsible for, and you're the one I got questions for. If I've got some responsibility, I got some influence, yeah, let's do something about that. But if I don't have anything to do there, then here's all I can deal with. And here is what we can deal with. Out there, Paul says, what? God will deal with that. And that is the great comfort. We can note that there is evil in the world. We can agree upon that and yet still leave it to God. In Romans chapter 12 and in verse 19, he says, never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. In terms of defining evil, I am always happy to define it. I'm always happy to identify it where it is clearly displayed, and yet leave the Lord to judge it. I do think that there's some real balance needed here. In Ecclesiastes chapter 9 and verse 11, it talks about the strong and the swift. And he says in the races and in the contests that the race is not to those of those exceeding abilities, but rather, he says, time and chance happens to them all. In Ecclesiastes chapter 9 and verse 11. There's a sense in which no matter what you do, and the vagaries of life will come. And time and chance will happen to the wicked person, and time and chance will happen to the righteous person. And Solomon kind of drives that home all through. And it's kind of a frustration of Solomon's because he would like things to work out the same every time. You do good, good things happen. You do bad, bad things happen. And what he says is, it just doesn't work out that way. And it's pretty frustrating, and especially if you don't believe in God. It's real frustrating. But I think sometimes we tilt so far in that direction that we forget that the Proverbs also have something to say about following the rules and working hard and so forth. In Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 21, adversity pursues sinners, but the righteous will be rewarded with prosperity. The Proverbs are shot through with those kinds of truths. And if we're not careful, we want on the one hand to show sympathy and understand that sometimes things just don't work out, even if you've done all the right things. But if we're not careful, we lean so far in that direction that we deny the reality and the truths that are so clearly and pointedly and weightily pointed out in Proverbs. We say it's not true. There's no good in following the rules. It doesn't matter if you've worked hard all your life. There is no value in that except doing the right thing. Proverbs says it's not true. It's not true. Just like when we talk about children. Can you raise your children in a godly way and yet they choose when they get older to follow different paths? Yes, that is possible. But don't ever deny the truth of what Proverbs says. You raise your children well. They will, by and large, stick to that path. That God does reward righteousness and punish wickedness. Even here, he does that. He does not do it in mathematical consistency as we would like. And so we leave room and we recognize the truth of Ecclesiastes chapter 9 and verse 11, and we recognize the truth of Proverbs 13 and verse 21, and we don't say one of these things is not true if the other one is. They're both true. And we need to uphold both of those realities and maintain kindness and sympathy. But let me go one step further. We can even express sympathy for the one who has made their own bad choices and is suffering the consequences of their bad choices. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15, that familiar passage that speaks of our Lord's sympathy. We do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who is tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. the notion that Christ sympathizes with us, with our weaknesses, does not mean that Christ excuses our weaknesses. And that is a big, big problem. That as we look out and we see people who are suffering from the consequences of their own decision, for us to get calloused and say, well, I have no sympathy for them. No. Christ has sympathy for you. You must. It's not a matter of you have sympathy so long as it's not their fault. Have sympathy even when it is their fault. And that is a critical balance. Because we, again, culture-wide, the sympathy is only for those that we feel like are excused. That's not what Christ is doing for us. He is having sympathy for those who are inexcusably guilty. And so my sympathy should spread. And my sympathy should not keep me from also saying, but here's what you must do. When my daughters come and they've been mistreated, maybe by their own sister, they come and they say, I've been mistreated, and this is what my sister said. All of this hypothetical, of course. This is what my sister said. So that's bad. That's hurtful. Here's what you have to do. Well, what does she have to do? My answer is always, what is that to you? Or some form of it. What has that got to do with you? I don't want them to think I don't sympathize. I feel it. It hurts. It hurts to hear me, for me to hear that one of my daughters said something to the other one that is hurtful. And so I feel it right there. I mean, I feel it really close. But still. And sometimes they might say something like this. Maybe I've said before. Why am I always the one that has to do the right thing? Because I'm the one that said I'd follow Christ. And as long as I uphold and maintain that He is my Lord, that I am His disciple, I am His follower, He is always the standard. And I will always have a responsibility, no matter what's going on. And that is a message that is getting drowned out. There are no excuses. There are no excuses that will take away your responsibility and your guilt. We all stand condemned. Now, I know there are ways that we can deliver that truth in sympathy, and there's ways that we can deliver that truth in self-righteousness. Job's friends came to him in self-righteousness saying, well, who can stand innocent before God? And what they meant was, you're guilty, not us. In other words, they preached all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And what they really meant is that particularly you, Job, not us. But when Paul preached that message in Romans chapter 3 and verse 23, he meant me too. None of us is innocent. And people need to know it. And if you're here this morning and you are not a Christian, understand, no matter what weight is on you, that ultimately you will not stand before Christ and be able to say, but all this weight. Because one thing that will happen is Christ will be able to point to somebody who's bearing way more than you and who is doing better than you. They responded. That's what Hebrews chapter 11 is all about. Look, you think that you can't deal with it? Let me just list out the people here and tell you about what they've gone through. And then it culminates in, let me get to Christ. You see what he does? In Hebrews 11 and 12, what he does is take away all your excuses. He says, there's nothing left. You can't turn around to that cloud of witnesses and say, it's too hard. They're going to, are you kidding me? But even still, Christ says, come. Gently, he says, come. And I'll make your burdens, whatever they are, lighter than they are. And though he does not give us a burden that has no weight, The weight is lighter because of him. Because we yoke ourselves to him. And we are pulling alongside of him. And so, if you would respond to that invitation, if you would take whatever accountability is yours to take this morning and respond, understanding that God has done all the heavy lifting, he wants you to cry out and to make yourself innocent by just crying out to him. Well, then we would beg of you to come and respond to the invitation while we stand and while we sing.